When on your deathbed you really have nothing to lose, so you might as well confess to all the bad things you've done. Like when you punched that goose, or called that pony ugly, or disliked one of my videos, or burnt down a museum, all of which are equally bad. A while ago, a seemingly ordinary man was on his deathbed. To the surprise of those around him, he confessed to a murder in 1977. It was an unsolved murder case. He had gotten away with it only to confess now, in the final days of his life. But then he miraculously recovered. So it turns out he wasn't on his deathbed, and he literally just confessed to a murder. Authorities immediately made efforts to bring the case to trial, meaning the man could face the death penalty, which, considering he expected to die anyway, isn't much of a punishment. His victim was a man he believed wanted to steal his wife, who he shot dead. He appeared in court with the same lawyer he worked with at his last court appearance 32 years before. It's unknown what penalty he was given. E. Howard Hunt was an American intelligence operative involved in the Watergate scandal, for which he spent time in prison. He might have been America's most notorious CIA agent, something the events surrounding his death didn't help. On his deathbed, audio emerged of him confessing his role in the JFK assassination. On the tape, he admitted to helping Lyndon B. Johnson arrange the president's death. Johnson was vice president at the time. Hunt said Johnson had the CIA kill Kennedy and cover it up after. He also said Lee Harvey Oswald was not a lone gunman, mentioning another shooter from France. It seemed like the JFK assassination had finally been solved, but then things got even more twisted. Hunt's wife claimed the two sons had manipulated him into making the confession, casting doubt over its legitimacy. Today it's thought the two sons planned the whole thing for media attention. Paul Hellyer is a Canadian politician. He is not dead, but at 94 is seen as in his final days. He was a Canadian defense minister during the Cold War, and surely knows a fair amount of secrets that might be of interest to conspiracy theorists. So when he recently claimed to have seen the inside of an alien UFO, I for one assumed he was a lizard person. He claims the CIA allowed him to examine a UFO discovered in Roswell, and that aliens have been visiting Earth for thousands of years. A politician of such high status would surely not make such a bold claim without good reason. Unless of course they are crazy. Hellyer has a history of saying wild things about aliens. He famously warned the government not to shoot down any alien spacecraft, saying it might cause an interstellar war. In 1983 there was a massive clock heist. 106 clocks and watches were stolen from a museum in Jerusalem. Some of the most valuable timepieces in the world were among those taken. The clocks and thieves disappeared without a trace, and for 25 years it was an unsolved mystery. But on his deathbed, a notorious Israeli thief called Naaman Diller confessed to his wife that he was behind it. Not long ago, the museum was contacted by a woman in Los Angeles claiming to have 40 of the clocks. The museum paid $40,000 for the items. Police later identified the woman as Naaman Diller's widow, who informed police of his confession. After 25 years, one of history's greatest heists had finally been solved, but only some of the clocks have yet been found. Willie Edwards was a black man who in 1957 was murdered by the Klan. For weeks he had been harassed by Klansmen who believed he slept with a white woman. One night he left to work as a driver and never returned. His body was found underneath a high-up bridge. Being 1950s Alabama, the Klan were suspected but not heavily investigated. They got away with it. 20 years later, a group of Klansmen were put on trial for his murder, but the judge decided there wasn't enough to prove murder. But then in 1992, one of the men accused admitted his involvement. He was 63-year-old Henry Alexander, and he was dying. In 1957, he and other Klansmen brought Edwards to a bridge and forced him to jump. In 1960, the bodies of 3 American housewives were found inside a cave. They were beaten to death. A local man covered in scratches and stains with blood was blamed. He soon confessed to the murders, but at his trial he claimed police forced him to confess, and that he was innocent. Still, he was found guilty and spent the rest of his life in prison. Several decades later it emerged that someone else might have confessed to the crime. In the early 80s, police were called to a hospital to speak with a dying woman. According to the officers, she told a story about being where the women died in 1960. She said that things got out of hand, multiple people died, and the corpses dragged into a cave. Clearly this wasn't strong enough evidence to free the man convicted, but still. The Brabant killers terrorized the Belgian province of Brabant in the early 1980s, leaving 28 people dead. It was a gang of three. Given that 28 died and over 40 were injured, Belgian police were criticized for never capturing the gang. The members were never identified. Their attacks simply stopped one day, as if the gang vanished into thin air. There were no breakthroughs in the case until 30 years later, when a man confessed involvement on his deathbed. He was a police officer and claimed to be the gang leader. It's thought the other members are also dead now, the executioner being fatally wounded in a police shootout, and the driver dying of old age. We now move on to the most bloody and shocking crime on this list. For years, a small English village was plagued by a strange mystery. Locals would often awake to find garden gnomes on their property, without any sign of how they got there. They began appearing in 2003 and continued for an entire decade. It drew national attention to the village of phantom gnomes, as I'm sure almost no one was calling it. But in 2013, a local man admitted to being behind it on his deathbed. For 10 years, he went out at night and secretly left gnomes in strangers' gardens, just to confuse them. For 10 years. I mean, that's quite funny, but not 10 years funny. It's a long time to be sneaking around in the dark with tiny statues. It's just weird. In 1986, a 76-year-old woman lay on her deathbed. She took this moment to confess to something awful. In 1975, she took a man back to her place, where they drank until he passed out. She then robbed him, and to get away with it, falsely accused him of rape. So the man was sent to prison. Since that day, he had been locked up, only to be freed with her confession 11 years later. She died soon after. William Desmond Taylor was among the most successful directors of early Hollywood, but in 1922 he was found dead inside his home. There was no obvious motive for murder, but he was shot dead. Close friends said that Taylor's life had fallen into chaos in the weeks leading up to his death, and that he had gone insane, but with no sign of a gun it couldn't be a suicide. He was murdered. Police identified over a dozen suspects, most of which either women who held affection for him or known criminals, but police were unable to pin the murder on any one of them. The case went cold with no breakthroughs, and eventually everyone involved in the investigation died. It's still officially an unsolved case. Margaret Gibson was one of Hollywood's best-known silent film stars, appearing in over 100 movies. 21 months after the murder, she was arrested for her involvement in an extortion and blackmail ring. The charges against her were later dropped, but it didn't stop people from assuming her guilt for both blackmail and the murder of Taylor. In 1964, she died of a heart attack. As she lay dying, she reportedly admitted killing Taylor. By this time, her career in Hollywood was long over, and she had lived as an unknown recluse. On her deathbed, she now revealed to a neighbour her past as an actress, and that in 1922 she shot and killed William Desmond Taylor. She gave no motive, but clearly admitted murdering him. Despite this, the case remains officially unsolved, and just as mysterious as it was in 1922.